Where was I? Reggie's death. Reggie died in 1926. That was the beginning of the worst time. Only Carol and I left, and we were really feeling the strain of keeping Cuffnells up to the standards we were used to. And there was that horrible business about the general strike. For a few days, we felt that Britain might go the same way as Russia. Fortunately, that did not happen. There were death duties for Reggie, of course, and they were crippling. Strangely enough, death duties were introduced by that Harcourt who lived over in Minstead when he was part of Mr. Gladstone's government. He was uncle to Aubrey Harcourt, who was engaged to my sister Tilly those many years ago. He ended up with a Newnham estate on the river near Oxford that should have gone to Tilly and Audrey. Well, I suppose he must have paid death duties on it, and I hope they were crippling. Cuffnells actually belonged to Carol now, but he let me stay there for as long as I wished. But it was getting harder and harder and more expensive to run. Carol and I were going to have to sell some of our assets. There was no market for any of the Hargreaves' land, and we didn't want to give it away for a silly price. I can't remember who thought of it first, but one day, when Carol and I were talking, our eyes fell on the manuscript that Dodgson had given me 60 years before. It was the first handwritten manuscript of Alice in Wonderland, called Alice Underground. Do you think there's any value in this? I said, picking it up. It meant little to me, as we had the copies of the facsimile that Dodgson had produced, and of course we had many copies of Alice in Wonderland itself. Campbell said he would ask around among his friends next time he was up in town. He took it to Sotheby's, and they were quite excited by the possibility. There was great interest in the Alice books in America, and if we were lucky, a number of wealthy collectors might compete with it at auction. When the world heard that Alice manuscript was going for auction, there was a move to keep it in England. Would I accept £5,000? Well, Sotheby's thought they could get more, maybe 10. And keeping it in England was not going to pay the heating bills for Cuffnells. Carol was all for letting it go to auction, and in the end, we did.
Lot number 319, the original manuscript of Alice Underground, presented to Miss Alice Biddle by Mr. Charles Dodgson.
£5,000.
6,000.
And on, up to 10,000 from the Americans.
£10,100.
10,500.
11,000.
And so it went up and up. The British Museum dropped out at 12,500, but still the British bookseller Mr. Maggs kept up with the Americans.
4,500.
14,600.
15,000.
15,200.
15,400.
Going once, going twice. It is yours, Mr. Rosenbach.
It was a record price. Cuffnells was saved for a good many years. Carol could look forward to a prosperous future. And in the eyes of the world, I was once again Alice in Wonderland. The 10-year-old child had come back to save me when I was almost at the point of despair. After having been Mrs. Hargreaves of Cuffnells for almost 50 years, Alice again. Alice in Wonderland, the real Alice. I was in the newspapers and I was famous. I liked it. And I loathed it. It was nice to be recognised and courted again instead of being just another widow who had lost 2 sons in the war. But I was continually being badgered by questions that were always the same, and many of them plain silly, like, did I really have a long neck like in the pictures, and was Dinah's a kitten still alive after 60 years, I asked you. But there it was. I was the real Alice, and so I remained for the last 6 short years of my life. Carol became my helpmeet and business manager, and there were press interviews and things to sign, and Alice in Wonderland tins of biscuits and pottery and playing cards and so on. The most exciting time was our visit to America. I'd been before with Reggie when he was visiting the Hargreaves' business interests in Canada, but this time was different. I was famous now, as any movie star, as film stars are called in America. I was more famous than the Prime Minister. Carol and my sister Rhoda came with me, and we went over in the huge liner, the Berengaria from Southampton. There were newspaper interviews and radio interviews and special visits all over the place. The big occasion was when I was given a doctorate of literature at Columbia University. I wonder what Papa would have thought when I became a doctor of literature, simply because I had encouraged that strange and awkward Mr. Dodgson to write his children's story down. I can't say I didn't enjoy the attention, but oh, I was tired, so tired, and so pleased when we got home to England. Carol was a big help to me in all this. He looked after the business side and took care of me all the time we were in New York or on the boat. Those tales of Carol and I falling out at Cufnell's were much exaggerated. We always supported one another. I always knew that Carol was a wonderful son to me. He helped with the Alice business and allowed me to live in Cufnell's as long as I liked, even though, as a surviving son, it was, strictly speaking, his. At this time, Carol met a Mrs. Hanbury Tracy. She was a widow with 3 children and was suitable enough, I suppose, but I never really could accept her as part of our family. Quite soon, Carol and she had a daughter. It was wonderful to have a grandchild, of course. I was so happy that the Hargreaves line would continue. I was in my 80s now. I would spend the summer in Cufnell's, watching the trees and the gardens and the deer as they wandered over our lawns. Then in the winter I would go to Westerham in Kent to be near my sister Rhoda.